Hello, BookTube, and welcome to, well, I'm going to call it a fiction review, but if I were honest, I'd have to say it's kind of a fiction review with some sideline material. You're going to see very familiar slides come up, my usual statistics. I'm going to talk through the structure and the content of the book, as I would do in any review. And yet, this is the last book of a 4-book series. And I've often said I'm not a personal fan of reading through book series. And in this case, I held out better than I expected that I would do. And yet by the time I reached this last volume, I was running out of something. I don't know what you'd call it, enthusiasm, love, or just grit. It all started to run a bit low. Today we are reviewing The Story of the Lost Child by Elena Ferrante, translated into English by Anne Goldstein. The year it was published was 2015. It's 400 pages long, and I've outlined the Amazon prices. They're all pretty good, and you can find some very cheap copies online. That's not a problem. So this is book 4 of the Neopolitan Quartet. You can see me struggling to categorize it. I'm saying fictional autobiography, perhaps? Memoir, saga. It's been a year that it's taken me to finish this. I started book 1 of the quartet in March 2025. I read book 2 in June, book 3 in November, and now I've finished book 4 with just a couple of days to spare in February. I feel more confident now that I can use the word saga, or maybe I can even stretch this to epic. This is an epic story of 20th century Italian women and their friendship and family links. And in hindsight, yeah, I'm really pleased to have read this series. And I will try and navigate that tricky territory between my usual attempt to describe the book as objectively as anyone can, and then separating out my personal reaction and trying to analyze that. What was that about, really? This is the section where I would normally talk about the author, but if you've watched the previous videos, you know Elena Ferrante is a pseudonym. We don't know who the real author is. She does not make her identity public. There was an Italian journalist in 2016 who put an article in the New York Review of Books and claimed that they had identified Ferrante as the Italian translator Anita Raja. That reveal doesn't seem to have been believed. It doesn't seem to have held water, because I don't see any more recent material sort of confirming that, validating that. I don't see anything from Anita Raja herself. There's silence after that 2016 story. So my feeling is, it's open to question. I think I'm going to take a cue from Marion at Marion H, her channel, because she recently did a video where she read Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandiaz, and she posted some questions in her description box, sort of open questions to us who were watching. Did we want to comment on those questions? And I thought, what a genius concept, and why have we taken so long to come up with it? Thank you, Marion, for doing what you think would be you think this would have been part of BookTube for a good decade by now, but there you go. But anyway, I think it's a fantastic idea. And I want to do the same thing, because Neopolitan professor Barbara Alfano says that up until 2016, she really was in favor of preserving Elena Ferrante's anonymity. She said it was crucial. Here's what she wrote. She says, "Until yesterday, I fervently believed that renouncing Ferrante's anonymity would cost her the power of her writing, which is generated by a great honesty of sentiment and emotion, the kind that can be found only by digging deep within one's own being and personal history. She herself has written, quote, 'I use plot characters as a tightened net for pulling all that is alive out from the depths of experience, for wringing it all out, including what I myself have pushed furthest away because it seemed unbearable. It seems to me,' and this is Barbara going on, 'it seems to me that this aspect of all the possible meanings that biographical information may have is the most important that an author can reveal in her work. The eventual recognizability of characters as real people would neuter and dilute the story. Now, Alfano also suggests that Ferrante could, by remaining anonymous, write with more powerful honesty about Italian women and about their attempts to define themselves separate from their relationships with men. And yet, this same professor had second thoughts when in 2016, The Story of the Lost Child was shortlisted for the Booker International Prize. And suddenly it seemed more fitting to Alfano that the author come out of hiding and take ownership of her work. Alfano speculated that the judges may have been discouraged from awarding the prize to Ferrante precisely because no one would come forward to claim the prize and all the usual post-award publicity events would have no focus. So for this author section, what I'd like to do is I'd like to post some questions in my description box and ask your opinion. Here's the questions I'm going to ask. Is there any good reason why the identity of Ferrante should remain unknown? What do you think? Does the public, having bought the books and streamed the television adaptation perhaps, do they have the right to meet and know the author and know more about the background and context to the books as it relates to her life? And also, is Ferrante denying her publishers possible additional income that she could attract by attending festivals and signings, by giving talks and readings? Open question. And or is the anonymity accelerating books sales? And so it's making up for whatever additional income Ferrante might make for her publishers by coming out and being more public. So those are my questions. Feel free to answer as many of them as you feel inclined to. Let's talk through the structure of the book as we usually do, starting with the setting in terms of place. Elena Greco, or as she now is as a married woman, Elena Erota. She returns to Naples in 1976, but she's not returning home to her neighborhood. What she does is she finds an apartment in a wealthier area of the city because she now has the money to do that from the sale of her first book. And she's probably not far from her childhood neighborhood in terms of actual walking distance, but her friends and her family perceive it as a much wider gap. Her husband is not with her, but she does have custody of her two daughters. And while you would think that the first thing Elena would always do if she was closer to everyone in Naples is become much closer to her best friend, Raffaella, or Lila, as she's always been called. But there's been a conflict, and Elena makes that clear in the first paragraph of chapter 1, which I'm going to read. From October 1976 until 1979, when I returned to Naples to live, I avoided resuming a steady relationship with Lila, but it wasn't easy. She almost immediately tried to re-enter my life by force, and I ignored her, tolerated her, endured her, even if she acted as if there were nothing she wanted more than to be close to me at a difficult moment. I couldn't forget the contempt with which she had treated me. In terms of time, if we think about the setting as time, Book 4 is interesting because it recounts more events over a longer period than any of the previous 3 books. We're going from 1976 until, well, the last named year in the book is 2005, but it's clear that the story doesn't end there, and it may well be that the epilogue actually takes us up to the year 2012, which is the year the first book in the Neopolitan series was published. If I were going to consider one factor that may have contributed to this strange fatigue that I felt as I was reading the 4th book, it would be all the years and years going by. With so much time to cover, this novel had to do summaries of what happened rather than some of the writing that maybe was more enjoyed in book 1 and book 2, where things were really slowed down, where you might have, like in book 2, 100 pages to describe a 2-week holiday. So you really felt that things were happening in real time to you as a reader as you followed the characters. And perhaps because Elena and Lila are aging, there's more retrospective writing. Elena's reevaluating herself and others, of course. And it's an essential thing, isn't it, for any human being to do, to look back and to consider what has been and what did they learn from the past. But for this reader, I've got to admit, this was somewhat draining. And that may be because I'm also at the same stage of life. Maybe that's it. You look back a lot as you get older because the future it's getting shorter. And you're, of course, asking, for me, how short is the future? That's a natural question. And maybe that meant that I wasn't really in the best frame of mind to be reading about other older women and their retrospectives. The narration in book 4 remains the same as it has been for the previous 3 novels. It's in first person, and we remain behind Elena's point of view. And as you might expect, after the initial hostility that I read about at the beginning of chapter 1, Leela and Elena reconcile. And not only that, but Elena moves to a new apartment that is directly above Leela's. And so for most of book 4, the relationship between the two women, it's more intense, I think, than it was in their childhood, because they literally live in each other's homes. They literally take care of each other's children and each other's partners. And it's so intense that even though Elena describes being away from Naples, being away from Italy, because she's traveling as part of her career as a novelist and later as a publisher, these times away from home, they don't get a lot of page space, and they didn't leave any impression on me. I don't recall the book as Elena's travelogue. She says almost nothing about the people she meets outside of Naples. It is Naples and Leela and the children. They form the great weight of this book, as well as those people in the neighborhood that they knew from their childhood. And that's as it should be. I mean, Elena did state as her purpose in writing the whole series. In book 1, she said she wanted to capture her best friend's life in a book so that Leela could not totally erase all traces of herself. And so in terms of characters, there aren't many new characters in book 4. You are reintroducing yourself sometimes to characters who were more familiar from books 1 and 2. Now, we talked about moving around, how Elena's travels, and yet the book isn't about her travels. Her ex-husband and children, they also travel. But again, none of this is given the loving attention that, say, book 2 gave to that 2-week holiday in Ischia, where you got 100 pages devoted to such a short amount of time. You really felt like you had been on that holiday. But the most you get to talk about Elena's trips or her husband or her children traveling is a paragraph describing one trip, or a paragraph describing sometimes several trips. So there's an unreal quality to all that travel. You could say the travel is almost, you're seeing it as if you were Raffaella, Leela, who never leaves Naples. In fact, who may still be in Naples at the end of the Neopolitan quartet. We're not sure. But she must regard all these trips that Elena makes as like something that you read about in magazines, but you never actually experience. A little aside about representation. We talk about Alfonso Carracci, who was the youngest brother of Raffaella's, Leela's first husband. He is queer, and I'm using that word deliberately because we as readers were never given more than glimpses of what Alfonso might be. And these glimpses, yes, they become gradually more revealing throughout books 3 and 4. And it's appropriate to the times, because if you think about it, in the early and middle and late 70s, early 80s, most men were still guarding how and with whom they were honest about their sexuality or the gender that they identified with. So we don't know enough ever, I think, to describe how Alfonso sees himself or what he wants. Elena and Leela, they give us their opinions, and I have to take them as something possibly true. But I never felt I knew Alfonso well, no matter how often he appeared in book 4. If anything, sometimes it seemed that he was an embodied foreshadowing, because there was a time when he liked to dress in Raffaella's clothing and wear her makeup, and Elena suggested that he was trying to become her, trying to project a performance of Raffaella. And you could have an interesting discussion, I think, in a book group about whether there was any connection between what happens to Alfonso in book 4 and what eventually happens to Leela. Problematic content. I think book 4 contains the greatest amount of fear and pain and loss. There's still an ongoing issue with Italy itself politically, the situation that began in the late 60s, what historians like to call the years of lead, the period between 1968 and 1988. It's a long time, during which there were militant neo-fascist and far-left organizations that they both had strategies to gain power, and they were using different terrorist activities to achieve their ends: bombings, assassinations, massacres, targeted kidnappings. In book 4, these things hit closer to the characters. Characters go missing completely, or bodies turn up later. There's also prolonged illness and palliative care. And if the words lost child in the title triggered anybody because they've experienced the loss of a child, either as a parent or a sibling or a friend, then you have a good defense mechanism in place, and you should probably listen to it, because this might not be the best time to read the story of the lost child. Also, Naples, as we know, is a volcanic city, and that makes it prone to earthquakes. There was an important quake in November 1980. You will find links in my description box with television footage that gives a sense of just how devastating it was for Naples and the surrounding villages. Ferrante has you experience the quake with her main characters. And finally, there is one brief sexually explicit scene. Elena has to witness it. She's not happy about it, and it upsets her, so she does get away as quickly as she can. However, the images, because they're disturbing for her, they linger in her memory, as unwanted memories sometimes do. So they are revisited here and there in the text. Rabbit hole time, and here's where I feel I should explain myself. I mean, did I enjoy the story of the lost child or not? Well, I'd say it was a bit of both, but not a 50-50 split. That's not the right percentages. I would say more like 80-20. 80% enjoyed my reading, and 20% affected by this strange fatigue, which I'll try to explain. But let's talk about the good stuff first. In book 4, I felt that Elena finally became a writer. It's true, at the end of The Story of a New Name, she gets her first book published, but as I was reading Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay, it was clear that Elena didn't feel comfortable with the writing process, didn't feel that she could truly own the title of being an author, if you will. Motherhood was exerting a lot of demands on her time and her energy. Elena had opportunities to mitigate that, and she didn't really take them. And even though her experience of becoming and being a mother was complicated, and I appreciated all this complexity. I appreciated that how Elena was sometimes immersed in looking after her daughters and seemed perfectly content with that, and yet more often she was distracted, as if she wanted something more, but she never was really able to define that. In book 4, we see Elena publishing multiple books, becoming a productive writer. And when she's 40, she travels to Turin to take over a publishing business. In the first chapter of part 3, Elena says about herself, "Once I turned 40, time had begun to race. I couldn't keep up. The real calendar had been replaced by one of contract deadlines. The years leaped from one publication to the next, giving dates to the events that concerned me and my daughters. Cost me a lot, and I forced them into the writing, which took me more and more time. When had this or that happened? In an almost heedless way, I oriented myself by the publication dates of my books." That's very different from the way she was in Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay, when she seemed to define herself more by the events of motherhood, by pregnancy and babies and the children growing up and starting to go to school. And yet, by the end of book 3 and the beginning of book 4, what Elena does is breaks the conventions of the nuclear family. And then she's got all these pieces that she has to try and put back together, but not in the same arrangement, not in that conventional arrangement. One aspect of this novel that I really did find interesting was how Elena and Lila's children gained their emotional support, because it didn't always come from their biological parents, or their biological parents were not always the best providers of that particular support at certain moments. The family life was messy, very messy, but credible, precisely because it was so messy. And I also appreciated how carefully Ferrante constructed the ending of book 4. So it reconnects the reader with the beginning of book 1 again, so you feel that you've come in a full circle. The ending was understated and open-ended, and for that reason, organic. Let me say what I mean by that. I mean, nothing felt contrived. Nothing felt like it was put into the ending in order to make it fit some kind of a plot constraint. You simply felt that events had gone the way they might well have gone, given the characters that you have and what they had all lived through. Okay, so that's the 80% that I enjoyed. So let's talk about the 20%, because I feel the 20% is wholly personal. I feel sure that you're going to find many, many readers who had a completely different reaction. So I wouldn't want anyone to take my 20% too seriously. So this is the non-review part, everybody. This is where I feel like we're going into sideline territory, because I think my misgivings and my lack of energy as I was getting toward the end of book 4 had less to do with the book and more to do with me. Firstly, I had a really, really tough time with Elena's relationship choices, the ones she made at the end of book 3 and continues on at the beginning of book 4. I opened up the story of the lost child to find Leela calling Elena an idiot, and I agreed with Leela. Elena begins a relationship with a man that I strongly distrusted and I strongly disliked. And what do? It's a first-person narration. So she was the narrator. Whatever she was going to live through, I was going to have to live through, whether I liked it or not. I could not escape. And so the chapters which followed that relationship, they were tough reading for me. They really were. I had to keep my own fury and frustration and impatience under control while I was reading. And if I'm honest, I didn't really like Naples. I didn't like the Naples that Elena moved me to as part of the novel and that I had to live with. I didn't like the dingy apartment that she moved into above Leela's. I didn't like the street crime. I didn't like the disturbing power of that sort of local family, the Solaras. I didn't like the way people had to interact with them. I didn't like the evidence of drug use, the needles, discarded needles in the parks. On several occasions, Elena did consider moving away from Naples, and each time I was hoping like crazy that she would. And of course, I knew that it was important and it was thematically meaningful for Elena to remain in Naples. I knew that I probably was going to be stuck there. Well, I thought for all of the book, actually, towards the end, there is a change. But by that time, it didn't really make much difference. By that time, the end was so close, and I was just thinking, well, let's just get to the end, shall we? Having said all that, one thing that I was fascinated with was there's a point in Raffaella Leela's life where they appear to be doing research into the history of Naples, and Elena suspects that Leela's writing a book about the city. And I did wish that I could read this history that Leela is writing. So clearly I was curious about the place, but not so curious that I wanted to actually live there with Elena and Leela. And that's it. But I would like to say I want to encourage anyone who's thinking of reading the series to absolutely do so. The London Review Bookshops, I'm going to link to a video where they talk about the quartet, and they call it groundbreaking. They say it functions as a great Italian novel spanning decades and the lives of several families. And yet it does something unusual in that it focuses on the minutiae of women's lives, which is groundbreaking and different. The writing style, for which I think Ferrante and Goldstein should take credit and be congratulated, it had this irresistible, gentle, drawing energy. In spite all my reactions to Elena's romantic choices, or where in Naples she chose to live, the act of reading the Neopolitan quartet novels, it was always a smooth, easily taken in experience. I always ended up reading more pages than I expected to. So with that, the review stroke sideline ends. In a few days, everybody, I'm going to comment on the questions posed by Marion at Marion H. In her video about the poem Ozymandiaz. I want to exercise my brain. That feels a little bit like harking back to my university work, where you're just suddenly presented with questions and you think, oh, I'm not sure. I've never considered that. So I think, right, I'm going to sit down, consider, and give you my answers sometime in the middle of the week. I hope your reading is going well. Mine's progressing steadily. You can see the books on the table there behind me, all 4 of them. I'm making steady progress through all of them. I'll look forward to seeing you guys again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.